We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day comrades, g'day Liz.
Hello.
Welcome back to Consciousness 101. How are you today, Liz?
I'm okay. I'm going to not kill myself.
Excellent. That is a good aim for the day. So this is a 101 episode. It's a bit shorter than usual, I think, although maybe not looking at the word count. The last couple of 101 sessions, we've been talking about different ways consciousness can be described for the purposes of studying it, and today we're continuing on that theme, specifically looking at the idea that there are many different phenomena which we call consciousness. So our reading for this is Block's Some Concepts of Consciousness. Liz, as you know, I bounced around a few different Block papers before just settling on this one where he introduces the access versus phenomenology distinction. You saw me struggle with the two BBS articles.
Yeah.
Decided that was a bit convoluted for 101.
Yeah, BBS articles are fun.
Yeah. We won't be able to avoid it when it comes to doing vehicle theories later on, though, I don't think.
Yeah.
Block talks about a bunch of different phenomena that we might call consciousness. We don't mean here just like a straightforward distinction between different concepts, like how we might distinguish the study of being awake versus being asleep from the study of whether we perceive something or not. Rather, we're talking about different notions of consciousness that are easy to confuse, namely accessibility, which is also called access consciousness, and phenomenology, which is also called phenomenal consciousness. So Liz, would you like to do my job for me and just say what that distinction is?
So access consciousness is about awareness, can you tell me or not? And phenomenal consciousness is about the what it is likeness. And one classic example is when a clock's chiming in the background and you can go back and count how many times it chimed, even though you only seem to feel aware of, say, from 9 onwards. And the question is, was there something it was like to hear those chimes, even though at the time you weren't aware of them? So the information is there, and you can go back and get it to inform your behaviour. And is there something that it was like to have that to hear the clock chime?
The distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness was named by Block in the 90s, really in response to Dennett's multiple drafts theory and Bars's global workspace theory. Now, I'd like to set up the distinction before we go through those theories, though, so we can ask as we're going, what notion of consciousness are the theories aimed at explaining? Does that make sense, Liz?
Yes.
Rather than just...
I'm being shot at by a skeleton.
Cool. So rather than just using them as a potential objection to theories, I just want to have this in place so we can ask questions about the theories as we go. So I initially wanted to use the 2007 version of the distinction. That's from a BBS article. And, you know, nerds and those who have read ahead will have noted that I started with the terminology used there. I talked about accessibility versus phenomenology as opposed to access versus phenomenal consciousness. I prefer that version of the distinction because it's more tied to attempts to understand real phenomena rather than thought experiments. That said, I don't think Block has a completely satisfactory version of the distinction, or rather the distinction will need further revision when we get through the theories. That is true regardless of which version we used. I will point to occasional differences between different versions of the distinction that Block has drawn. In 2007, it's just cognitive access versus phenomenology. In 2002, it's access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness.
Okay, why does that matter?
The main thing for me was in the later version, the 2007 version, Block presenting the distinction for the purposes of making some arguments, and some of those arguments are very convoluted. It's not always clear what the relevance of particular phenomena that he talks about are.
Oh, right, yeah. That's right. That was really weird.
So in my previous draft, I had a couple of thousand words before even saying what the distinction was, which I think would have been fine if we were doing a main series episode. But for a 101, it all ended up being too unclear. So what I've settled on doing, even though I'm saying that this is really about the 2002 paper, what I'm going to do is sneak in some of the interpretations of experiments that Block gives in the 2007 when they're relevant. And so that way we'll sort of get the best of both worlds. We'll get the clearer form of the distinction from the 2002 paper, and then we'll be able to use how that's applied to real-world data as opposed to thought experiments from the 2007. So I'm cheating a little bit, and it's not just about one paper.
Yeah.
Okay, so on to this one. This is called Some Concepts of Consciousness. At the start of this paper, it's one of the places where Block famously calls consciousness a mongrel concept, which is an image I kind of like, right? That we're so bad at thinking about consciousness that we just jam a bunch of different notions together and then study their unholy mutated offspring.
Sorry, I'm just thinking of all the lovely mixed breed dogs that exist.
Right, I was thinking of pugs and other things that are brachycephalic and just absolute disasters. To try and avoid this mess, Block's going to suggest a few distinctions, and the one that we'll focus on is the phenomenal versus access distinction. That said, we will in coming weeks in 101 come across Liz Irvine's work, who has argued quite well that consciousness science is in fact a science of a bunch of different things that are all jammed together and just called consciousness, even though they're all distinct functions, and that there isn't a science of consciousness to be had because it's too much of an arbitrary grouping. Block's approach is different. It's not an eliminative one. It is one that says there are still things that can be meaningfully called consciousness once we start drawing some distinctions. So let's get on with that. We'll start with phenomenal consciousness. Here's what Block says, quote, "Phenomenal consciousness is experience. What makes a state phenomenally conscious is that there is something it is like to be in that state," end quote. Liz, you'll notice this uses Nagel's terminology that we introduced a few sessions ago, but is this the same notion of consciousness that Nagel was talking about, do you think?
Something that it is like to be in the state, is that what he says?
Yes.
No.
What's the difference?
Nagel talks more about points of view.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing some conceptual revision here already. Something's missing from this. Where's the point of view, or where's the subject?
There's something that it's like to be in the state might implicitly suggest a subject. There might be some forness in there, for someone in there. What I'm trying to say is that it's really tricky, and the subject can really easily sneak in, and it might just be a reflection of our language, but I think we need to be careful. So
possibly Block and others are just thinking that the for the subject is implicit or so obvious that it doesn't need to be stated directly.
I think you need to be careful in assuming they don't mean
that
for the subject, I think is what I'm saying.
Start looking at some examples. So sensations like taste, pain, like the paradigmatic examples of phenomenally conscious mental states. Ultimately, to explain them, we'll want to explain why they feel like they do and not something else or nothing at all. So thinking about the kinds of measures of consciousness that we've been talking about over the last couple of sessions in 101, intuitively what will be the most relevant here when we're describing or explaining these sorts of states. So if you think about the paradigmatic experiment that really motivated heterophenomenology, it's something like mass priming. So what's the difference between being able to report something and not? Whereas the paradigmatic example of an experiment relevant to quality spaces is a discrimination task. If we think like about the sorts of things that you use multidimensional scaling for, this is about describing the relationships, specifically of similarity between different appearances. So I think that's what's going to be more relevant to phenomenology. That said, of course, there's more to heterophenomenology than just its sort of paradigmatic example. And we did talk about with Clark that the quality space work probably could be included in that as well. But I think what comes from this is that we have one question that we can ask about the theories of consciousness we're going to be talking about over the next few sessions, and that is, do they explain this aspect of consciousness? Are they aimed at explaining why mental states feel like something at all, or explaining why mental states feel one way and not another?
Are both of those access or phenomenal? Or?
Both of those are phenomenal.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. They're just sort of two different questions that you can ask about phenomenal.
Cool.
Which might, of course, collapse to the same question if you're a quality space theorist in Clark's vein. Cool. So, access consciousness. This is what phenomenology is contrasted to. This is a somewhat different notion. Here's how Bloch introduces it. Quote, a mental representation is aconscious, so that's just his abbreviation for access consciousness, if it is broadcast for free use in reasoning and for direct rational control of action, including reporting, end quote. I think it's interesting here that the term broadcast is used, because that's a theoretical term that was introduced with the global workspace theory, which is one of the theories that I mentioned earlier, which motivated Bloch to work on this distinction. Or, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I don't know what his motivations are, but which seemed to be what he was responding to in his first publication of this distinction. So we'll think about global workspace in the coming weeks. Next time, our next 101 will be looking at some of the metaphors that are employed to motivate and understand global workspace theory, and then we'll look at some more recent theoretical work from neurosciences on it. I like to get my head around these phenomena with specific types of experiment. So I think in understanding access consciousness, we're thinking about phenomena like binocular rivalry. So, Liz, do you want to just remind us of what binocular rivalry is?
You have two different images projected to each eye, say of a house and what's the normal one?
A face would be.
And a face.
Yeah.
And your experience alternates between seeing a house and seeing a face. So you sort of switch between the different inputs.
Yeah, even though the inputs remain
the same.
With access consciousness, we're thinking, what's the difference between the visual processing of the image of the house when subjects say they see it and when they say they don't see it, when they say they see something else. Reportability matters for measurement here, but Bloch does say, quote, I see a consciousness as a cluster concept in which reportability is the element of the cluster that has the smallest weight, even though it is often the best practical guide to a consciousness, end quote. Here, he's really on about the importance of the mental state, to internal processes. Report is just how we operationalize it, but it's not the only or even the most important process that it enters into. So what are some of the internal processes that are going to be important here? The big one is what went in his initial definition, which is the rational control of action.
Rational control of action.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure you need to be aware. Rationally control your action.
This is sometimes an objection, right? Because the primes seem to have some sort of rational influence on action, even when you're unaware of them. I think
I'm not
perhaps,
sure I would say objection.
Yeah.
So much as there's just so much theorising in the background.
What we want to get from this is that often when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about access consciousness or accessibility, and not phenomenal consciousness or phenomenology. This seems intuitive using some of the kinds of measures of consciousness that we've been talking about. So whenever a subject needs to answer a "did you see it" type question, the target is access consciousness. But if we do something like use similarity judgments to say something more about the structure of phenomenal properties, that's when we're talking about phenomenal consciousness. I want to skip over some of the theoretical work Block does around the nature of access consciousness here, because I don't think it's especially comprehensible at this stage with the 101 series. And I think there are some unhelpful errors in it. There's a bit of running together of functionalism and computational theory of mind in general. And what's more interesting at the outset anyway is why think that these are distinct phenomena as opposed to thinking that they always run together. One reason Block offers to think that this is a real distinction between accessibility and phenomenology is that it's conceptually possible to have one without the other, that you could have accessibility without phenomenology and you can have phenomenology without access. Now, at this stage, this is just a conceptual distinction. He isn't saying that this could actually happen or does actually happen. Rather, he's trying to show that these are distinct concepts, and so we want to avoid, at the start of theorizing anyway, conflating them. I think also there's some burden of proof shifting going on here. Block's trying to get those who think they always come together or that one explains the other to provide arguments for those claims rather than just assuming them. This, I think, is in particular in response to Dennett and coming right from Block's review of Consciousness Explained from 92. So, conceptually, what would accessibility or access consciousness without phenomenology be? Any ideas, Liz?
Some of the stuff in a computer.
Oh, yeah.
Like the thing in front of me.
Mm-hmm. So it shares representational states between different systems, between its processor, its solid-state drive, its random access memory, its screen, so on. Yeah. Cool. I would have liked if he'd done that, because he's about to piss us off. So he's going to use the example of a partial zombie to illustrate what this would look like if it could exist. We do need to get our heads around this, and it is just for the purposes of drawing a conceptual distinction. He's not trying to say anything metaphysically weird using them, Liz, but what's a philosophical zombie?
Oh god, it's something that behaves like me that doesn't have experiences. So, probably a lot of people would think of a robot.
So, a complete philosophical zombie, which is the sort that people get really weird about, is something that would be from the outside, completely indistinguishable from you in every circumstance, but which somehow we're supposed to imagine doesn't have any phenomenal consciousness. Again, let's control our emotions and just sort of focus on the point that Bloch's trying to make here. A partial philosophical zombie is one that can access certain mental representations without having any phenomenal feel to them. So this is the sort of thing that turns up in fiction quite a lot. So in stories that ask us to reflect on the nature of subjecthood and personhood, Data in Next Generation would be a partial zombie before he gets his emotion chip, right? Because he can clearly evaluate things and decide on the best course of action. So he has emotions, but they don't feel like anything to him until he gets the emotion chip in the movies.
Emotions, if you think emotions are what enable you to evaluate things. But I think some people would say if he can't feel them, they ain't emotions.
Yeah, but then why are they motivating for him?
All I'm saying is that you are making a claim that is grounded in your theory. I agree with your theory.
Yeah, I am.
But a lot of people would say that Data is a pure zombie.
Yes. So.
And I think Data is the perfect refutation of that claim.
So that's what I was trying to do, was to slightly make fun of this idea of a zombie.
Oh, and I called you on it, sorry.
Yeah. But, if we follow the rules of the fictional world, Data's a partial zombie because he has these mental states that are evaluations of things, but they're not felt in any way by him. The thought experiment Bloch gives is of super blindsight, which is a completely imagined scenario which is just designed to illustrate what access without phenomenology could be. And I want to say that because Bloch is careful here. He's not saying that this is about reality, it's just a tool for drawing the distinction. So let's start out with blindsight. So blindsight is something that can occur after damage to part of the visual cortex. When people lose just a part of their visual cortex, they seem to end up with quite a blind spot. So like a part of their visual field that they can't make any discriminations in, and they say they don't see things if it's hidden in their blind spot. But in experimental circumstances, they're better than chance at guessing what's presented to the blind field. So you present a shape like a circle or a star to where you know their blind spot is. You've already mapped that out by them telling you when they can and can't see things. And then just ask them to guess what's there, and they say, that's ridiculous, I have no idea, I can't see anything. You say, just guess. And you find that there are some people who have suffered this brain damage who do better than chance at guessing what's there. For Bloch, these real-life cases, the subject seems to lack both access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness of what's presented to the blind spot. Now, setting aside the correct interpretation of these, because there's some suggestion that, at least some people might just be using a conservative criteria for saying what seeing something is or not. So they might mean when they say they can't see it, they might mean what other people would mean by saying I can't see it properly. So there's some controversial there, but if this is the correct description of the phenomena, there's some cognitive access because people are better than chance at guessing at what's there, but it's not properly rational in this sort of like top of the hierarchy of rationality sense that Bloch's talking about, because the subjects think they're guessing. They don't have access to their reasons as such. Now, Bloch's understanding of access as a cluster concept matters here. Access consciousness is just one kind of cognitive access. So the notion of a consciousness, this is a quote, the notion of a consciousness that I have framed is just one of a family of access notions, end quote. So just being able to guide the guess is not sufficient for access consciousness, even though it's a kind of cognitive access. So this is one of the places where we see a bit of a difference between this 2002 version of the distinction and the 2007, where Bloch seems to, in the later one, seems to have stopped talking about access consciousness as such and just talked about different degrees of cognitive access, I think, to try and make understanding this sort of phenomena a bit easier. That's an aside on the difference. We're still trying to get our heads around what motivates this distinction between access consciousness and phenomenology. So the imagined case Bloch's going to use is super blind sight, inspired sort of loosely by real blind sight cases. An imagined super blind sighter is someone who's blind sight but is super in two senses. First, that they're always right about what's presented in their blind field. So in the sort of experiment that we're talking about, they'd get 100% what's presented to the blind spot.
Unlike me, who just managed to run in a
circle. Yep. Nice. The second sense in which they're super in this sort of imagined case is that they don't need an experimenter to prompt them to guess when something is being presented into their blind field. They just spontaneously guess and are always correct. If such a scenario were possible, we'd have a mental representation of what is in the blind field that is accessed, rationally accessed, to some extent at least. But it doesn't seem like anything to the subject accessing it. It doesn't have any phenomenal qualities. So it's conceptually possible to Bloch that you could have access at the top of the rationality hierarchy without phenomenology. So what about the other way around? What would phenomenal consciousness without access be like?
Counting the clock chimes, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Bloch would see in that sort of case that before you get the prompt to count them back, they're phenomenal but not accessed. Yeah. But once you get the prompt, they're both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Bloch, again, asks us to think about this by imagining a creature that has both access and phenomenal consciousness. Now, suppose it has a kind of brain damage that leaves all of its perceptual systems intact, but which destroys its capacity for the rational control of action. The mere fact that such a thing can be conceptualized, Bloch suggests, means we should start by treating access and phenomenology as conceptually distinct, and that if we're going to put them together, we'd need some argument for doing that. A more helpful example here is the one that you just mentioned, Liz, of the clock chiming in the background and then you being asked by someone else, what time it is, and counting back the number of chimes, or of noticing a fridge or air conditioner suddenly turning off or a computer fan suddenly turning off. Now, we often have those sorts of background noises like the fridge or air conditioner that we don't notice, that they still influence our behaviour. So we adjust the volume of our speech to speak over the fan, for example. And if someone were to ask us, do you hear the fridge running in the background? Do you hear the air conditioner? You need to direct your attention to that to be able to answer them rationally. But when they unexpectedly stop, we seem to hear them for a few seconds leading up to them going off and then hear them stop. So with these examples, Block suggests that we are phenomenally conscious of the noise all the time, but that we're only access conscious of it when our attention is drawn to it by someone asking about it, hey, what's the time? Can you hear that? Or by it stopping mid-conversation and us needing to change the volume at which we're speaking, so that draws our attention to it. For Block, this is driven by the realization that not only are we hearing the noise or have heard the change, but that we have been hearing it all along. So that's why he thinks that it's that seeming that he's placing a lot of emphasis on.
We heard it all along.
Yeah.
Do you know that we heard it all along? So he reckons there's something that it's like, even though you couldn't report it. Even though you weren't aware.
Because when your attention comes to it, it doesn't seem to come from nowhere. It seems like it was always there, and you just...
Why does that mean it was phenomenal as opposed to represented?
Yeah, so why isn't it like the refrigerator light illusion? Which is just what we're going to get to, so I'll keep that bit in. Because as you were saying there, Liz, that some of us, and a lot of people have, of course, find this reliance on the introspective judgment of seeming to have heard it all along problematic because of the refrigerator light illusion. So do you want to just run us through what that is?
The refrigerator light must be on all the time because every time I look it's on. But to go back to the chiming clock, I remember as a kid, when we stayed at my aunt's house, she had a clock that would chime, and I remember counting and getting it correct, and then wondering whether I heard it. Like reflecting back and thinking, did I hear it all the time, or did I process it unconsciously? So, yeah, I was always introspectively, I'm unsure.
Just because it's there when you look doesn't mean it's always there. We're not necessarily justified in that assumption. But I think Block's trying for something a bit more minimal here, and that is, it's just a little bit of burden shifting. And my understanding of him is that he thinks he's done enough to say, if your theory says there's an access versus phenomenology distinction, you need to show that. And if your theory says there isn't an access versus phenomenal distinction, you need to show that as well.
So he's trying to say prima facie there's this distinction.
Yeah. And that there's this conceptual distinction. Does it map onto the real world? We do determine that by theorizing. So far, Block's used some thought experiments to motivate a conceptual distinction, right? But elsewhere, and this is where I want to go back to the later paper, he has argued that in reality, access and phenomenal consciousness are distinct phenomena. So the 2007 Mesh paper in BBS has a lot of arguments, and you have seen me struggle to pick out a useful thread from that. But one of the arguments is that access doesn't constitute phenomenal consciousness. That's relevant as a critique of some of the theories that we'll talk about in coming weeks. But for our purposes in this session, it's in this context that he makes an argument that phenomenal consciousness overflows cognitive access, that there is more that we're phenomenally conscious of than can be accessed. Here, Liz, I think things are getting more interesting because we're not just now talking about a conceptual distinction, in particular a conceptual distinction built on nothing but our pre-theoretical imaginings, but instead we're looking at what our consciousness is actually like using experiments. The first of these experiments is due to Sperling.
Wasn't it done in the 50s?
It was done in the 50s. That's quite right. It is still an important finding, and it is one that is regularly replicated, which I think is One reason why people really want to build around it, because it's a very robust set of data. In Sperling's original experiment, subjects are shown an array of 3 rows of 4 letters or numbers for just 50 milliseconds, followed by a blank screen.
And there are 1,000 milliseconds in a second?
That's right.
Right, so super duper fast.
Yep.
Not half a second.
No, not half a second. In this, present them the array for this tiny little amount of time, 0.05 seconds. Subjects say that they saw all or almost all of the characters present, but when asked what the characters were, they can only recall on average 4 of the 12. When they're probed just what ones did you see, and they're asked to just say what they saw, the average recall is about 4 of the 12. But what's interesting about it is that after the array has disappeared, if you play a sound, and these days this is sometimes done with a visual cue as well, but if you play a sound that's like low, medium, high, indicating which row the subjects are meant to recall, so low for the bottom, middle for the middle, high for the top row, subjects on average correctly report almost all of the characters in that row. In general, 0.05 seconds, you see this array, you think you see 3 rows of 4 letters or numbers, probe of what ones did you see, you get about 4 of them right, but which 4 you can report, we can influence by after the array disappears, queuing one of the rows. The block says, quote, an attractive picture of what is going on here, and one that I think makes the most sense of the data, is that although one can distinctly see all or almost all of the 9 to 12 objects in an array, the processes that allow one to conceptualize and identify the specific shapes are limited by the capacity of working memory, allowing reports of only about 4 of them, end quote. His understanding here is that the subject's phenomenology includes all of the characters, but only 4 can be accessed by the processes underlying working memory, and that's what you need to be able to name the letters or numbers, as opposed to just saying it's a letter or a number. This idea that we seem to experience more than what is accessed is pretty robust, and we'll follow Dennett and be neutral here and not say that we do experience more than what's accessed, but that it seems that we experience more than is accessed. So another study by Landman et al. Had subjects look at an array of 8 rectangles, and these could be vertical or horizontal. You see those for half a second. So if you're imagining this as a fixation point in the middle, then around that, arranged in a roughly circular shape, 8 rectangles. Some of them are vertical, some of them are horizontal. Now you present subjects with that and ask them what do they see. Subjects just report seeing the 8 rectangles here. Now, if you show that sort of array and then follow it by a blank screen for 0.2 to 1.5 seconds is the range that they used, and then you get another array of 8 rectangles. Now, with a line indicating a target, they can only say if that target rectangle has changed orientation about half the time. So you see one array of rectangles, screen goes blank, the array comes back, and then you get a line indicating, say, one of the ones on the top right. You have to say, has that stayed vertical or has it switched from horizontal to vertical? People are only right at that about half the time. Like with the Sperling subjects, though, if the cue is presented in such a way as to inform the subject which rectangle to maintain in working memory, so you do this after the first array has disappeared, but before the second one comes on the screen, subject performance increases to an average of between 6 and 7 out of 8 correct. So you get a huge increase in performance just by having the cue appear between the two arrays of rectangles rather than just with the second one. Block has a hypothesis about what's going on here. He thinks that in these kinds of studies, the whole stimulus is a part of the subject's phenomenology, but that only a portion of that phenomenology is cognitively accessible. The experiment manipulates what part of the phenomenology is accessed. This isn't the only possible interpretation of the experiments, of course, so Block goes on to try and rule out some of those other interpretations. We don't need to focus on those today. They'd be more relevant when we're trying to decide between theories. Alright, so we don't need to be convinced that Block has the right interpretation of these experiments, but I think we can get our heads around what he thinks the distinction is from these examples. What do you think, Liz? Was that helpful? Is that more helpful than partial zombies?
Yeah, I'm weird. I like reality when it comes to developing a theory.
So we want people to be asking of the theories in coming weeks, what notion of consciousness are they trying to explain? If it's both phenomenology and access, is one being explained in terms of the other? Are they separate entities? If it's just one or the other, is that a limitation of the approach? Alright, now let's finish off by getting confused again. So we got confused at the start, Liz, about awareness, and I want to bring that up again. So remind us what awareness is.
Probably operationalized in terms of reportability to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, but you can remember it and stuff too, but then you remember it and report it.
Yeah.
It's probably a fuzzy concept. And then probably the actual phenomenon probably has fuzzy boundaries.
Yeah.
So things are on the edge of awareness.
Yeah, definitely. But I think I'm with you. I prefer to use awareness for that sort of idea of consciousness that's tied to reportability. And I wanted to bring this up. So I think how we like to use the word, we're sort of referring to a kind of access or a set of kind of access processes. It might even be, the same thing as what's Block calls access consciousness in the 2002 sometimes. Although we wouldn't have the rationality constraint. I think that does get us into a mess. The mess that I want to wade into, though, is that how we prefer to use the term awareness is not how Block uses the term at all. I'm not sure that of the two papers that I used for this, the mesh paper and the O2 Some Concepts of Consciousness paper, I'm not sure that Block has a consistent meaning of awareness that he uses in both. So in the O2 paper, talking about the air conditioner, fridge, clock chime type example, he says, quote, "You were aware of the noise all along, one might say, but only at noon are you consciously aware of it," so that's when it goes off. Or you're asked to count
You're
it.
aware? What?
Yeah. So the second part of this quote tells us, I think, what he means by aware. That is, you were P conscious of the noise all along, but at noon you were both P conscious and A conscious of it, end quote. And later he also says, quote, "This case involves a natural use of conscious and aware for A consciousness and P consciousness. Conscious and aware are more or less synonymous, so when we have one of them, we might think of it as awareness, but when we have both, it is natural to call that conscious awareness," end quote. By which I think he means that we should use conscious for access consciousness and aware for phenomenal consciousness and conscious awareness for both together, which I find a really weird use of aware.
Yep.
Which I think because I think that fits more naturally with did you see it type questions than similarity judgments. So because I think of it in terms of those operationalizations, if anything, I'd go the other way.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I've got a headache.
I don't know. Obviously, I've never asked him about this, and I wouldn't expect to ever have the opportunity to, but I suspect Block would take my reading to be conflating the phenomena he's trying to distinguish. In the 2007, this is the Mesh paper, he uses cognitive accessibility instead of access consciousness. That is, the whole family of relations that access consciousness was supposed to be a part of initially, and phenomenology instead of phenomenal consciousness. The reason he gives for this is, quote, the highly ambiguous term conscious causes more trouble than it's worth in my view. Some use the term conscious so as to trivially include cognitive accessibility. To avoid any such suggestion, I am from here on abandoning the term phenomenal consciousness in favour of phenomenology, which I've tried to follow for him. So that was the end of the quote. I've tried to be respectful of that and talk more about phenomenology than phenomenal consciousness. I think, I suspect he would see how I would use the term aware as doing something like that, sort of trying to sneak in access when it should only include phenomenology.
Oh, wow, I have a really different conceptual landscape.
Yeah.
I think is all I can say. Because, wow, God, I was going to think if you're going to identify awareness with the phenomenal or access, it would be access.
Access, yeah. No.
And so if he thinks that's obvious, then I don't even know how to start talking. I'm really beginning to feel Kuhnian paradigms.
Yeah, like he's just...
you can't communicate.
Yeah, like he's just drawing up the landscape in such a different way. So often, like when I've taught Block and stuff in the past, I've just not used awareness at all. And we've seen some of the reason for that, but it does get more confusing. Earlier in that same section that I just quoted from the 2007 paper, he says, quote, we may suppose that it is platitudinous that when one has a phenomenally conscious experience, one is in some way aware of having it, end quote. Which sounds more like the 2002 paper, but he also says, quote, sometimes people say awareness is a matter of having a state whose content is in some sense presented to the self, or having a state that is for me, or that comes with a sense of ownership, or that has me-ishness, end quote. Which is what?
It's subjective point of view.
Yeah, so we're running Nagel back into awareness.
I really have a headache.
Yeah. So on that quote, it sounds like he might be saying he disagrees with that understanding of awareness. Like sometimes people say but he then endorses a same order theory of awareness in this different sense. Quote, the same order view says that the consciousness of relation can hold between a token experience and itself. A conscious experience is reflective in that it consists in part in an awareness of itself, end quote. So that now this awareness, which started out the same as phenomenology and then added in appearance to the subject, now is just appearance to itself. I think this is meant to avoid it being an access relationship. So I just don't know why not just say some people see aware as implying access, which is true, that's what we do, and say it doesn't mean the same as phenomenology. I don't know if he's tied himself in knots here, or if I've tied myself in knots here, or both. But I think it's best when trying to understand the access phenomenal distinction as presented by Block, so his specific version. It's best that we just don't use the word aware, which perhaps isn't very helpful, because sometimes it's quite natural to talk in that way. But I got quite bound up in this and really struggled to find a consistent meaning of aware. And like all terminology in consciousness research is messy and people mean slightly different things when they say it and all that. So maybe it's just that. But given that we were supposed to be talking about some concepts of consciousness to try and get clearer on what the explanatory targets of the theories were, I'm not sure that we ended up doing that. But we have, I think, a meaningful distinction between asking people, did they see something, and asking people to make similarity judgments about the nature of their experiences. I don't know if that's helpful at all, or if I've just made it more confusing. The big picture of what's at stake is that some people think that you can explain phenomenology in terms of access. And I think Block wants to put pressure on that notion. And I think we might find that helpful later on. But I wanted to do these two papers before the theories because I find it helpful to have this terminology going into talking about them. So when we talk about Bars next time and his metaphors for understanding consciousness, his theatre metaphor, it will be very helpful to know this distinction between access and phenomenology. Just to be able to ask about what phenomena are being explained, what experiments might be explained under these models. But sort of like what we were saying when Block was doing the conceptual form of the distinction in the O2, here's an imagined scenario that helps you get your head around the different concepts. Having that in place so we can coherently ask for each theory, what does it say about access? What does it say about phenomenal? Have they justified the relationship between those two concepts? Is going to be helpful, especially when we get to critiques of functionalist theories, Liz, which you and I think don't do enough to justify the claim that phenomenology can be explained in terms of access.
Yes, so I think keeping the distinction is clear. I need to not conflate access with awareness, which is something I have done by default.
Ultimately, I think there are reasons why awareness is a better notion than access when it comes to consciousness. Sort of more like the 2002 version of Block than the 2007 version, because there seems to be something particular about those mental states that we can report having. They seem to be able to do different things than those mental states which we can't report having.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's because access is a much more general notion than that I think awareness is a more useful notion, ultimately. But that's our notion of awareness, not Block's notion of awareness, which I'm not even sure what that is. I think it has changed over time. Well, if nothing else, we've learned that you don't get clear answers as to what phenomena are without theories, that just working with your concepts raises more questions than it answers.
Indeed.
With that, we'll call it a day. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. No, sorry, I'm dealing with the fact that this is just eating late.
Where are you at? Deep slate?
Yeah, I don't know.
His motivations are, but which seemed to be what he was responding to in his first publication of this distinction.
Sorry, I died.